Whether it be ending over a dozen clones of himself or stopping one of the strongest Viltrumites to ever live in Conquest, Mark Grayson has been placed through trials and tribulations with his antagonists. However, could he do the same on a stage of enemies as monstrous as Naruto's, including the infamous S-class criminal organization the Akatsuki, or even the legendary Madara Uchiha, whose glance forces countries into submission, or how about the dude who beat him up? So, just how far could Mark make it into Naruto realistically? Would he get stomped, or is he truly in... Firstly, to open the video up, it's critical to grasp just how powerful Mark is when going over these earlier sections throughout the series, and through his battle with Conquest, we can better ground Mark's power through Cecil, who would be marching through the Pentagon, remarking that he's got probably the most powerful attacker he's ever seen, beating the snot out of probably the strongest hero on the planet, referring to both Invincible and Conquest, who has been implied to be beyond Nolan, fitting with how he himself rebuted Adam Eve's statement of him not being Omni-Man, stating that, yeah, bad news for you, displaying how both Cecil and Conquest directly see him as a threat greater than Nolan, despite Mark actually being able to gradually overpower Conquest and parry off many of his strikes, ultimately ending the battle, which probably is consistent for his scaling, as a much younger Mark states that he's approaching the level of his father, who long before season 1 completely diverted a meteor the size of Texas, which VSBW calculates would require moon levels plus levels of force, which this much later Mark would also be able to do as well, showing his level of improvement from that very scene when he was just grabbing considerably large asteroids and tossing them back into space. However, that's not all, as if you're willing to grant him his later feats alongside his father and another Viltrumite named Thaddeus, he could destroy the planet Viltrum, which is stated in the official handbook to have a gravity 25 times that of Earth, which is under a presumed and extremely realistic time frame of 5 seconds. The amount of force required to do this would be calc to large planetary levels of force, which is not only extremely impressive, but far beyond any of the Akatsuki members, including Deidara and all of his bombs, like the stated pinnacle of all explosions in the C3, which is calc to similar levels of force that could bring down the infamously durable member in Kakuzu. And while the case for him could be made higher, seeing as he survives a mountain collapsing on him in the Akatsuki novel, the level of force is still nowhere near what Invincible's basic strikes would be carrying at this point. And the reason why I'm just blowing through the Akatsuki is due to the level difference here. Let me put it like this. If every Akatsuki member were to exude their most powerful attack at Invincible, including the C3, multiple Bijou leveling C2, Ashura Path missiles, Cannon Blast, Itachi Susanoo's Yasuka beads that could bomb part of the Chibaku Tensei, it literally wouldn't even matter. In issue 52, around 10 issues prior to fighting Conquest, Mark would battle off the Mauler twins, who would be engaged in their typical banter before they would decide to just blast Mark much later with this missile, of the which he tanked, that's supposed to be a missile that would be fired at the sun and prompt such a massive explosion that the following solar flare would be the biggest ever recorded. However, a solar flare is billions to trillions of times more powerful than the largest nuclear explosion ever created, and for a bomb to match the energy output of a solar flare, it would have to have hundreds of orders of magnitudes larger than the Soviet Union's Tsar Bomba, with many sources stating that simply this is so insane, it's actually far beyond what is physically or even theoretically possible with our current technology. The energy required would be so large that even if we multiplied the Tsar Bomb's energy by trillions of times, we wouldn't even come close to matching the output of even a moderate solar flare, much less beyond the largest one ever recorded. Perhaps you could say that due to it not being just a nuke but rather a missile, it would be able to reach a more internal level of the sun, as in general the cause for solar flares would be the sun's magnetic field, and it's incredibly strong and complex, with areas of intense magnetic activity, which sometimes these magnetic fields become tangled or distorted, especially near sunspots, causing an ultimate internal release of radiation and energy. However, I would honestly still doubt this, but who am I? I'm an anime YouTuber, not a physicist. Many of the higher end Akatsuki members are almost certainly reaching speeds beyond light, with Itachi also being able to literally react to and just completely tank the strongest version of Kirin, which was heated up via the Amaterasu rather than the Art of the Dragon Flame, where in its normal state it's hailed as something that moves at light speed in Fan Book 2, which the third data book also supplements. And Itachi does this after battling Sasuke so strenuously, trying to convince him of an all-out fight while also dealing with the ailments of his sickness and usage of his MS, that Itachi just is quite literally blind in both eyes, with the left going completely blind due to bro's absolute machine gun spamming of his Amaterasu, as you can tell by his eyes being completely whited and faded out, indicating that his cataracts are so impaired he can no longer accumulate protein along the eyelids. So, to say that a much more healthy Itachi could scale beyond light speed shouldn't be unreasonable at all, with the fourth data book noting that it's only in the EMS when Sasuke finally surpasses his brother, when prior he was unrecognizably more powerful than when he was relative to the fourth Raikage A, whose lariat is nearing the speed of light, which is consistent for other characters at the time, like Mifune, whose sword slashes Sasuke could clash with in base, which are just generally considered to be light speed. As for Mark, while his scaling for light speed isn't as abundant, scaling to a Season 1 Nolan who could travel to the planet Thraxa in roughly like a week would be more than virtually any character in Naruto, to put it simply. As mentioned in my last Invincible video, just how fast Nolan would have to travel would be just completely reliant upon which neighboring galaxy you take into consideration for where Thraxa would be located. The first option would be the closest non-disputed galaxy to the Milky Way, the Sagittarius Dwarf Siroto galaxy, although due to this being a dwarf galaxy, you could rely on the Andromeda galaxy, since it's the closest complete galaxy to the Milky Way, and even at its lowest ends, presuming it was a one-way trip to the closest, the closest possible destination of the statement that it would account for, you're still looking at massively faster than light plus levels of speed. However, the only contention to this comes in saying that there aren't many other feats to substantiate this outside of arguably Alan the Alien flying into the solar system, which has a wide variety of speed calcs, depending on how one defines the words solar system. The official handbook states that Mark moves at an average speed of 800,000 kilometers an hour, which is still pretty impressive, clocking speeds over 600 times that of sound, which Naruto characters could react to pretty early on. So, if you can't tell, there's an extremely vast range of speed at which you could assert both Mark and the Naruto cast to follow, so I'm just going to presume they are relative in each of the matches. However, if you are to assert, either of the polar ends, that Mark is either below light speed, or thousands of times beyond it, you can do so. And the same should also be said for the Naruto cast. If you're going to highball one, do it to the other. But as for how Mark would get around the Susanoo and Itachi's case, it's likely only going to be a battle of attrition, trying to outlast Itachi and overcome his defenses, which are considered to be beyond basically any ocular ability revealed up until chapter 402, and more importantly, much later, as in the second fan book, it notes that Itachi has the ultimate absolute defense, which would be above other absolute defenses like Neji's rotation, Gaara's sand, and even Sasuke's Susanoo through the summit. The Autumn Mirror is stated to be something that, by its own nature, is an ethereal construct that manipulates its own properties in accordance to the attributes of an oncoming attack, and when coupled with the legendary Totsuka blade that seals whoever it pierces into a world of drunken dreams, Mark will be on the defensive for most of the battle up until Itachi reverts to a lower form, and although Itachi's Susanoo has never been shattered from what we know, both Sasuke and the stronger Madaras were shattered, so with Mark's massive attack potency advantage, it would also just be as though multiple Biju bombs would be fired point blank in the same spot at Itachi's Susanoo, which would likely just break it down, allowing for Mark to have an opportunity to then beat down on Itachi. And while Pain is a similar case with many other, really solid abilities to potentially mitigate some of Mark's, like the Shinra Tensei, Pain doesn't have enough external defense to aid him, and even if he were to resort to his ace in the hole, the Chobaku Tensei, we see that when faced with this, Itachi pretty casually deduced that if they were to exude enough force on the core, it would collapse. So if Mark were to just blast through the core like they did with Planet Viltrum, then Pain would be done for, meaning that basically for the entire Akatsuki, they'd be wiped out pretty handily. So how would Mark fare against a threat far beyond the Akatsuki? And who who better than Sage Mode Hashirama, who I cannot stress enough is astronomically beyond the Akatsuki. Out of the conversation, with his base form being confirmed to be superior to EMS Madara plus the Ninetales, threats that are not only much stronger than the version of Madara who could rival KCM2 Naruto, who would be far beyond the KCM1 Naruto who could outspeed the light speed Raikage by dozens of times, which Hashirama could stack Sage Mode onto for even more monstrous levels of speed, but even the full Ninetales as well, which is a being stated to be capable of turning the world to ash, and when coupled with Naruto, could completely shatter the earth apart. Fitting with how Kurama's attacks like the Bijou Bomb can rival several other Bijou Bombs, each capable of producing multi-continental levels of power, and yet even with that, Hashirama's wood constructs are stated to be equal to Madara's Ninetales and would come very handy against Mark, partly because they're absolutely monstrous offensively, but could also be used while Hashirama maintains a literal stronghold defense, which would tank the massive explosions of his and Madara's battle. Even inferior attacks like the Deep Forest Emergence is stated in Databook 1 to be an all-powerful technique used for offense, defense, molding the village, and even capturing enemies, which he can enhance with the Deep Forest Emergence with Deep Forest Bloom, which has poisonous flowers, which the pollen is immensely poisonous, and although Mark can actually hold his breath for several weeks on end due to his body's ability to more efficiently break down the oxygen, attacks like potentially the Deity Gates would also be really useful in suppressing Mark, but they can be broken. So now that Hashirama is a character reaching much faster ranges of speed and a much greater amount of AP, the fight really does just come down to how fast you think Mark is and if you'll just be blitzing him around, and this will be kind of the same for the following matches, which I'll have to repeat a little bit later. However, here I would probably go in so far as saying that he should beat Hashirama, although getting around all the abilities, like even the more minute sensory, will be complex, although more times than not, Mark should clear this round. Even if Hashirama were to put the pressure on Mark, managing to actually damage him progressively, Mark's recovery and survivability is profound. It would likely still allow for him to continue battling, when in fact, Hashirama's survivability is almost completely unknown outside of his healing factor, which basically aids him constantly. Against Conquest, Mark is literally beaten to a pulp and forced to rely on his sheer unquenchable thirst for blood after seeing Eve get turned into a donut. So even if Hashirama were to take a form of attack more akin to what Obito used in the blood spreading spraying technique whenever he attacked the Mizzen, Mark would probably still live and still fight as long as he is, presumably stronger. Moving on to the strongest non-Sixth Path character in the entire series, Might Guy. Upon opening the 8th gate of death, where after being kicked around by Madara, he would laugh and state that Guy is the first since Hashirama to make him feel this excited, which might even suggest that both he and Hashirama would be stronger than Jubito, which isn't unreasonable, to be honest, but that's a topic for another day. Here, we know that Madara has grown far beyond what Obito achieved in his Ten Tails form, with Sakura noting that he's in a different tier of fighter, and that judging by Minato's sensory, his Sage powers alone surpass Obito's, which is why Madara is also able to harness many more Sage abilities like the Light Fang. What's funny about Guy though is I don't have to discuss any abilities for Mark to circumvent. All of his techniques are just straight up hands. The 8th gate takes him dozens of times beyond his base form that was rivaling the stronger KCM1 Naruto, with the only downside being that Guy can neither maintain the form very long, nor can he tank as many hits as all of his muscle fibers are constantly tearing and his bones are fracturing upon each strike. So with Mark being extremely durable and Guy being extremely fragile, I would actually lean towards Mark pretty handily, pretty plain, pretty simple. We get the point. Lastly, we have Kaguya and the godlike alien whose chakra was so abundant that Madara's body exploded, with her being the only one capable of utilizing the Ameno Manaka transportation technique due to each use being so far above everyone else's reserves they can't even use it. This ability revolves each around her dimensional time spaces, each housing a planet and a star, and with her being confident in destroying her largest and most central dimension, Genesis, I wouldn't be surprised if her AP would be far beyond Mark's by this point, with his only real argument again being his potential high-ends, and if you were to describe to those, well then, all in all, while I personally wouldn't have Mark clearing the gauntlet, it's probably not a stretch to say that he could, and ultimately live up to his title of Okay, listen, I'm just playing, but if you guys did enjoy, then please consider subscribing as it helps the channel out a ton and lets me continue to grow and put more content out there for you guys, like Invincible content. Maybe I'll go back to posting some One Piece content here and there if you guys do enjoy those, but more importantly than all that, if you don't subscribe, then you hate puppies. But may God bless you all, and love you guys.